Hi, listeners. This is Chris Batts, your host of the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. Here's a brief clip of my conversation with the chairman and CEO of one of the fastest growing law firms in the U.S.
When I came to the firm in 1986, there was a lot of discussion, and that was back at the time when the partners all met around a table. The firm had decided it did not want to grow more than 25 lawyers, and they didn't want a super active litigation practice like I had. So there were people who didn't want to bring me on at that time. And here we are today. It's just amazing.
Just a reminder, the PDF transcript of this audio is available to download. Go to liongroup.recruiting.com/podcast. As many of you know, we interview corporate defense law firm leaders, partners, general counsels, and legal consultants. You're listening to episode 26 of the Law Firm Leadership Podcast.
Broadcasting from Kansas City, this is the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. In each episode, you'll receive actionable ideas and hear personal leadership stories of the top corporate defense law firms from around the United States. Enjoy a front row seat with law firm leaders, their partners, and legal consultants as we discuss life and leadership.
Welcome to the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Batts with the Lion Group. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Russ Welsh, chairman and CEO of Polsinelli. Under his leadership, and for 20 years, Russ has seen Polsinelli grow from 90 attorneys and 4 offices in Missouri to now 850 attorneys and 21 offices nationwide. This growth includes national recognition of one of the fastest growing law firms in the U.S., also being named one among the top 100 U.S. law firms, as well as nationally ranked Chambers USA healthcare and real estate practices. Prior to leading the firm, Russ was the chair of the litigation department, having extensive trial experience in product liability, torts, trade secrets, just to name a few. Before joining the firm, he was a trial attorney for the U.S. Justice Department in Washington, D.C., and he also received his law degree from Georgetown University Law Center. Welcome, Russ, to the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Chris. I look forward to our conversation today.
Russ, this is one of those interviews where I have been waiting a long time because I get to sit down with a statesman, and not just Kansas City, who I know has a lot of civic involvement and have a lot of love for the city, but also has seen decades of change in the legal industry and has seen the growth of a law firm basically apply a 10x. And so I want to just kind of start off with a basic question that I tend to ask attorneys and leaders who've experienced the kind of growth you've seen. When you took the helm in 98, were you anticipating becoming a firm of over 800 attorneys when you were less than 100? Was that something in your mind?
Not at all. When I took the helm, I was anticipating growing the firm, but really more focused on specialties than size. I could never imagine us getting to 850 lawyers, having at the time been primarily a Kansas City law firm.
Yeah. And I know at that point, I think law firms were no bigger than maybe 300 attorneys or something like that. And so...
Yeah, that's probably right.
Yeah. It's interesting to see the change and increase of numbers. What basically led you to start adding to the firm? And I think one of those first additions, was it the 2004 merger with St. Louis?
Well, there was that, but let me go back just a little bit. When I took over in 1998, we had some really excellent clients, but we also knew at the time that we were unlikely to be a merger target. Kansas City was not as robust a business community as the firms on the coast or out of Chicago would have wanted to have joined them. So we sort of charted our own path. But at the time, we really knew that we had some clients that those larger firms coveted. So we had to be invested in our clients, and that meant investing in lawyers that had the specialties that our clients needed. But that was really the first element of growth, yeah.
So it was kind of building a moat for the firm and creating that competitive advantage by keeping those clients and servicing their needs.
That's right. For example, we didn't have any intellectual property attorneys when I took over, but we had an institute that was a life sciences institute that we were doing a lot of corporate and tax work for because it was just being formed. We knew that they were going to have discoveries that needed to be patented, so we went out and hired our first patent lawyer, and I think it was 2000. And from there, we have well over 100.
Was there a large client base or just a couple key clients that really drove you guys to move outside of the Kansas City metro?
It was a combination of key clients and lawyers who were perhaps a little audacious and felt that they could create something beyond a local practice.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of the initial acquisitions you made, because if you weren't, as you said, on a major coast and acquiring, which would be natural growth in the major cities as you're kind of organically acquiring. Let's talk about St. Louis. When you grew with that first group, what were some takeaways from that initial merger? Because mergers weren't happening that much, or at least it was kind of new and fresh for a lot of people. Was it kind of like, oh, we've done this and now we can keep on doing this, or did it build momentum? How was it to kind of grow across the Highway 70 to St. Louis?
By the time we combined with the Schulthaus firm, which was the one we merged with in 2004, we had grown to about 30 or 35 in St. Louis by the kind of ones and twos and small groups that firms traditionally grow through. So the Schulthaus firm itself had 35 lawyers. We were looking to have a more prominent position in St. Louis. They were a business firm, and it seemed to fit well. I think the lesson from that was we kept separate offices, 2 offices in St. Louis, and St. Louis isn't Los Angeles. And so I think if I had to do it over again, I would have combined those offices earlier. We did combine them about 5 years later, but I think it would have been a better integrating experience if we'd have combined the physical locations sooner.
Yeah, that's good wisdom. Knowing that you also then picked up, say in 2006, kind of a banking and real estate boutique, and knowing that real estate's a really key component of the firm now, was that acquisition part of some of your key leaders in real estate, or was that down the road when you began picking up those key partners in real estate?
In the early 2000s, we had a CMBS practice, so commercial mortgage-backed securities practice. We were doing a lot of real estate lending work for banks and private equity groups, both in the States, but also internationally in Europe and in Japan when that practice was so active. We thought we needed a presence in a financial center, and it was more natural for us to look to Chicago for that growth and, plant a flag than it was for us to go to New York, for example. It was partially a credibility issue to the markets by having an office in a financial center. So while that acquisition of a small real estate and banking firm took place in 2006, it was probably 4 years of looking for the right opportunity. Many of the firms at that time were ranging from 30 to 40 lawyers, and the senior lawyers were really looking for an exit strategy. That was not attractive to us, so we passed on a lot of opportunities before we found this group that joined us and helped the catalyst for our growth in Chicago, where we now have about 110 lawyers.
Yeah, that's fantastic to have that hand count in Chicago. Let's talk about, I think, what looks like your largest acquisition in your backyard in Kansas City. So some people think that you shouldn't acquire different cultures or even different firms in the same city, but you guys did that back in 2009, February 1st, Shugart, Thompson, and Kilroy, 180 attorneys. How did that process go? Because that's pretty amazing undertaking. Have you guys always been talking about combining? What led to that?
We were looking for a stronger litigation practice than we had. While I, as you mentioned, am a trial lawyer, litigator by background, when I moved into this role, it left a little bit of a vacuum in our litigation department. And so we had been looking for that. We knew the Shugart Thompson lawyers, and we thought a merger might be attractive. Candidly, we talked to them 4 or 5 years earlier, and both of us decided that wasn't the time. I don't think we were mature enough as a law firm to swallow that entire group and integrate them. The focus wasn't to look for additive bodies in Kansas City. It was really to add litigation strength, but also get a presence in Denver and Phoenix, which they brought. On the other hand, the Shugart firm was looking for additional business strength, broadly defined real estate, business transactional work, and financial services work, and we brought that to the combination. Our offices were to the east of Kansas City, with D.C. by that time and Chicago, and we'd also opened an office in Wilmington, Delaware So that was the impetus and this kind of the strategic reasons for the combination.
Russ, would you also say, I mean, the timing of it, I can't help but notice, was it encouraged because of the recession in 2008, 2009 for the firms to combine?
No, it was terrible timing.
Yeah.
I mean, if I had to choose a time to combine, I wouldn't choose right before a major recession. And we obviously weathered that together and probably were stronger for it. But, those were challenging times for many of our clients, and there can't help but be consequences to the law firm.
Yeah. Russ, what kind of advice would you give someone making a combination like that? I mean, you had to deal with interesting integration, because if you're acquiring a firm in a city you didn't exist in, you had like distance integration. Now you had to deal with combining large groups of attorneys in the same office or same physical presence. I mean, versus St. Louis, where you had two different offices. But tell me about that. How did integration go with an acquisition like that?
There were some bumps in the integration process. We had a pretty systematic approach to integration. It's better now, 10 years on, than it was then, but we were attentive to the need to integrate and make the two one. Every firm has a culture. We highly valued our culture. We thought our culture and the Sugar culture were very similar. In many ways they were, but in some ways they weren't. And the most important way that had the most significant consequences at the time, even though we were about 300 lawyers at Polsinelli, we were practice managed. And that's even more important today than it was then. Sugar had those offices in Phoenix and Denver, and they were more office managed. So there was more flexibility at the office level than we thought appropriate for one large firm that we had become. And changing that attitude and culture from an office managed culture to a practice managed culture was probably our biggest challenge in that combination.
Yeah. And you guys have remained a practice managed culture. Is that correct?
We have, for sure. We highly value it. We think we're better serving our clients by managing by practice, and it helps integrate smaller offices to know that they're able to work on major deals or litigation even if it's not in their home area.
Yeah. So I noticed also that after that, and frankly, it's about a year and a half later, you guys expanded into California with considered California's largest women-owned bond counsel firm. Is it Quaitman?
Yeah. Lisa Quaitman.
Yeah. Tell me about that. I mean,
she's still with us.
Is she? That's fantastic. Tell me about the strategicness of moving into kind of bond counsel as it relates to probably relationship with governments and things like that.
Truthfully, it wasn't as much her actual practice as it was Lisa and her approach and her persona in the LA market that was attracted to us. That acquisition was driven, frankly, by our healthcare practice. And you say, well, why is that? Because she was a bond lawyer. We had a growing healthcare practice, and we were interviewing for a system to represent that had facilities across the United States. And the system asked us during the RFP process and the interview process, we're really looking for a firm that has offices in every time zone. It was the summer, and we laughingly said we do because Phoenix didn't go on daylight savings time. But we knew when we had that interview and eventually got that work that we needed to open a West Coast office to serve the client. So that was the impetus for the combination in LA. And I think we have 50 lawyers there now and a lot of healthcare lawyers.
And that's excellent. So, and I'm also seeing a trend here that you're picking up women-led law firms. So with Lisa in California, and now the next acquisition was in Atlanta with Nancy Rafuse. Tell me about that journey when you picked up Nancy's firm with her partners. I
don't think either of those mergers were intentionally women-owned firms. Nancy Rafuse and Lisa just happened to be excellent lawyers who had an entrepreneurial spirit because they created their own firm, and that worked well in our culture that continues, even though with size, continues to have an entrepreneurial bent. We're at the very end of the first generation of our law firm. Jim Polsinelli, who started the firm in the 70s, is retiring in a couple of months, and I'm stepping down after 20 years as the chair. I'll step down at the end of this year. So we're while we have a lot of institutional clients now, we have this attitude that we've got to fight for every client and continue to fight for the ones that we have now. And so their approach, Lisa Quaitman and Nancy Rafuse's approach to practicing, fit well with ours.
Yeah, that's excellent. So, Russ, I can't help but want to draw out wisdom, anecdotes, that sort of thing from the process of what we just walked through. So 20 years of growth, almost a 10x applied to firm size, headcount. What advice would you give someone? Let's say I had you talking to an entire group of men and women who are in your shoes now when you were in 1998 taking the helm. What advice would you give them who has aspirations to grow their firm to a full nationwide firm? What kind of advice would you give them?
I'd say it's great to be aspirational, but you have to be realistic as well. So know your firm really well. Listen to outsiders, including consultants. Don't swallow everything they say because that may not fit with your culture and approach, but be realistic about who you are and what you can accomplish. I mean, I'll give you an example. In the early 2000s, when we were really thinking about scaling some of our practices and growth, we knew we could not be a seven-figure net income firm at that time because we didn't have primary offices on the coast. So we didn't strive for that. We tried to take advantage of who we were rather than try to be something else that we thought was unattainable. And that's led to a lot of this growth, keeping the core in lower or mid-cost cities so that we can have a value proposition for clients. And that really comes from knowing your firm and knowing it well.
Yeah.
A couple other things I might say is be prepared to travel.
Okay.
When we were smaller in primarily Kansas City, I'd say I do management by walk around where I'd walk the floors of our office. Now it's by fly around. And if you don't do that, you just become a franchise model, and that's not a law firm.
Yep.
And then the final thing I'd say is some of the things you don't do, some of the deals you don't do are the best. And I've looked back at a few potential acquisitions or opportunities in cities that we could have accomplished early on and recognized that now where we are, we'd probably be unwinding those if we had done them.
Thank you, Russ. I think those are excellent points. And I want to ask another question. How have you grown as a leader? So imagining yourself 20 years ago and where you are today, what's been required of you that wasn't necessarily in you before? Or how have you grown through the process?
It's interesting. When I took over, we had a managing partner, and he was the first one at the firm, and he'd done it for 10 years or so. He said to me, about the only piece of wisdom he provided me was that he knew it was time for him to step down when somebody would come into the office, and he already knew what they were going to say, so he didn't listen to them. I think that was pretty good advice. And so what I would suggest that one of the ways I've grown or at least continued to be a successful leader is listen to people, not just, it's not your way or the highway. These are complex organizations that are really people driven, and you really have to stay close to your people. I've obviously grown financially. We're probably just over $500 million in revenue. And when I started, we were $27 million in revenue. So that financial growth requires you to be more sophisticated in your financial analysis and ability to balance those issues.
Yeah. You had mentioned consultants, but I noticed you didn't mention recruiters. How important were consultants and recruiters for you doing that kind of 10x growth that you experienced?
I recall one time in the early 2000s sitting at a round table of chairs of firms that were about our size. So we were around 100 then in the year 2000. And the first round table I went to, there were 3 other firms of similar size that I gravitated to talk to their managing partners. And the next meeting, there were only 2 of us left. And so the acquisition of law firms of that size was something that was on my mind, and the consultants and the recruiters were, at our heels, if you will. We wanted to retain the ability to control our own destiny. So we listen to the consultants, but we take them with a grain of salt because they're not in the system. They're not in our firm. They don't know our people. We do use recruiters, obviously not always, but we're open to that. I think the best recruiters are the ones that really know their candidates as opposed to are just, fishing for a fee.
Yeah. Very good. Russ, I want to ask a question. Let's say a question out there for growing law firms. How did you guys approach growth from a financial position? Meaning, did you fund growth with equity or with debt or both? Or how did you approach that? That's when I talk to clients, it's always an issue of how do we make this work and how do we approach it? So I'm curious.
So there's two major financial consequences of growth as I look at it. There's the capital side of things. You need a new lease, a long-term lease in a city. You need computers and desks and chairs. And then there's the personnel side of it. People start with your firm on day one, and obviously they expect to be paid from the beginning, but their revenue stream doesn't come in for 3 or 4 months. So you have to balance all of those things. The way we did it was a combination. Some of the capital items we have financed and used some debt for an appropriate level of debt, far below the debt our clients use, obviously. But on the lawyer side of things, we have not used debt to fund those. We've used current income to fund the lawyer acquisition. With, I guess, a limited exception, occasionally when we've done a merger, we've spread the cost of that over a couple of years, no longer, but over a couple of years instead of a one-time hit, because the return on that combination is going to be over time, not exclusively in that 1 year period. One thing I should add is I've heard law firm leaders say our firm doesn't have any debt. I've talked to lawyers in those firms and they say they all have debt. So you're going to fund these firms one way or the other, either by use of some institutional debt that's guaranteed by the law firm or some personal debt that the individual lawyers have to assume and put capital into the organization.
Yeah. And I was gonna just simply ask: can law firms grow and scale without institutional debt, outside debt?
I doubt it. Somebody's going to have to come up with the financials, the cash to accommodate the growth. In the early 2000s, again, when we were about 100 lawyers, we did some deferred income because we knew we were going to grow. It wasn't really this kind of growth. It was bringing in those specialists that I thought we needed for our existing clients. And then we returned that income 4 years later with, a growth factor to it. And it worked well, and that gave credibility to the strategy.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. I wanted to talk to you about something that law firms very well were faced with and are affected by, because it affects their clients and it affects your own financials. But tell me about, and I'm more looking for advice for leaders, for folks like in you in your shoes, because you have weathered the tech bubble and the Great Recession of 2008. What was that like? And what is some advice that you would give law firm leaders? Because we're going to be facing another one eventually.
Well, it was challenging because of our geography at the time. The tech bubble wasn't as challenging to us as the recession was. By the time the recession came along, and for us, it spanned 3 or 4 years for different businesses and different industries. For us, the impact of the recession was in 2008 and 2009. Before that, we were doing really well. After that, we did really well. But we did have the impact in those years. I think diversification mattered a lot then. The practices that were the most impacted were those that were using a lot of debt, meaning a real estate finance practice that was CMBS driven, our pure real estate practice where the developer side of that used a lot of debt. Those practices were substantially impacted during and particularly right after the recession. The requirements that clients had for legal skills changed. Lending is a perfect example. We were doing a lot of lending, and while it takes legal skills, younger lawyers can do a lot of the initial work there. When we're on the workout side of it, during the recession and post, it really took more experienced lawyers. The one thing we think about now in the coming recession, whenever that may be, is that our lawyers, while we do specialize, we need some cross-training so that there's more flexibility in the lawyers than the ones that are so specialized they can't move even into related areas. So we think about that and try to do cross-training and on legal work. I think that's the greatest. But the diversification of the practice, for example, there were not many M&A deals going on in the 2008 through 2010, but our corporate lawyers who did M&A deals were pretty busy with healthcare deals. They were a little less impacted by the recession, and we were able to push our true corporate lawyers into working more closely with our healthcare lawyers. And actually, that helped us coming out of it so we could do more of those deals as our healthcare practice continued to grow nationally.
Yep. I appreciate you sharing that. So I know that you are transitioning and Chase Simmons is going to be taking the reins. Tell me about that process and what are you going to be doing afterwards? I mean, are you staying at the firm? Are you retiring like Jim Polsinelli? What's that look like?
Well, in terms of me personally, I'm going to step down from this position at the end of December. I'm going to stay on for 8 or 9 months, and then I'm going to retire. Okay. During that 8 or 9 months, there's a couple of strategic initiatives that I'll take on and then just be a sounding board for Chase in his new role. The process, I think it may be interesting to some who are listening to this podcast. We had 4 candidates internally, and in law firms, the candidates are always internal. Yep. So they were all leaders in their own right, and I was really sensitive to respecting them during the process and not losing them because of the result of the process. I know some law firms that have 3 or 4 candidates and they select one and less than a year later, the others are gone. I did not want that. That would be very harmful to our firm. And so I worked on it for a couple of years before, trying to get these people together to work together on initiatives and innovation. And so they became not just colleagues, but really friends. And then since the time of the selection, and it was a pretty intense, detailed selection, they continue to work together and they're all leaders. And so it's been, I think, a very positive outcome.
That's excellent. I would definitely say that's a positive outcome. And I love your approach. You said something about them all friends and they're all leaders. That sounds very healthy as opposed to what I think you and I have both seen.
Right.
Let me ask you a question, just again, reflection over the past 20 years. What are you most proud of, Russ, over the past 20 years?
I think the quality of our firm has grown even at a greater rate and pace than the size of our firm. And so in reflection, I'm most proud of the improved and quality of the lawyers that have joined us and are part of us today.
We talked about this a little bit before, but I want to get your take. So you have seen so much change in the legal industry, and we both are seeing a shift from a seller's market to a buyer's market. But I wanted to get your take on where do you see the legal industry going, and what are some of those influences? What really has caught your eye about some of the major changes that are coming?
I think law firms are now run more like businesses, but there's a fine balance that you have to be mindful of, that the individual lawyers, and particularly the shareholders or partners of your firm, have a lot of choices in their life, and you have to maintain those relationships. So, it's always been a relationship business, both with clients and internally, and I think it'll be more so as the mobility of the industry continues. In terms of technical changes, obviously there have been a lot in the last 20 years. I remember a few years before I took over, we had a meeting and we were getting desktop computers for the first time in the mid or early 90s, and somebody had to ask what a mouse is. And you can't imagine that today. But also, I think the advent of artificial intelligence is going to substantially impact the practice, and I know a lot of firms and lawyers are talking about it. Not sure we're all doing enough about it.
And how do you see artificial intelligence affecting the private practice attorney, the in-house attorney, and that sort of thing?
Well, think about 10 or 15 years ago. In litigation, a lot of what drove revenue was having associates or young partners reviewing documents to determine if they were discoverable or not. Now we have computers doing that in e-discovery, and it's taken revenue from the law firms, but it's more efficient and it's more effective, and the lawyers just do the final review as opposed to the initial cut. Well, that's now happening in due diligence work, it's happening in patent work, and it's happening in contracting work, and it's going to continue to impact the law firms going forward. So not only we have to talk about and think about what that impact means when we have our own artificial intelligence systems as we grow, we have to figure out how to price that to take in not just the time, but the value.
Yeah, lots of change. I want to pivot a little bit, again, to some more personal subjects that we were going to chat about. And one of them that is kind of near and dear is we both live in Kansas City. I noticed that you're a Jayhawk graduate. Were you from the area? Were you Missouri or Kansas resident?
I was kind of both. I grew up on both sides of the state line in the kind of part of the city. So I was born and raised in Kansas City and went to KU undergrad, and then I went to D.C., as you mentioned earlier, to law school. I stayed there for 10 years, law school and after law school.
Yeah. And I just can't help but notice, and I didn't want to have this ridiculous long intro that you definitely warrant, but I just want to list off your community involvement. So I've noticed that you've been on the boards of the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce, the United Way of Greater Kansas City, and Civic Council. You're the past chairman of the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce and board of Starlight Theater, board of trustees of the Lymphoma Society, Mid-America Chapter, the local bar association, the Kansas City Area Development Council, the Community Blood Center. You're also involved with the ABA. Tell me about that. Tell me about your heart as it relates to serving civically and your heart for Kansas City.
So if people haven't been to Kansas City, they're missing something. It's a real livable city. I think that I know from statistics that it's a generous city. The percentage of, charitable contributions here is quite high, but it's a mid-sized city, and we grew out of this city for opportunity, but we never left the city because we love it. So I think we have an obligation as attorneys, as business leaders, to give back to the city that's our home and has benefited us. That's the kind of driver. I did have some role models in that. I wouldn't call them mentors because I wasn't close to them, but in the 70s and 60s particularly, there were law firm leaders were very actively engaged in the business community and organizations like you described. But by the time I took over in 98, that had changed. And I think the change from law firms becoming more business-like also might have pulled some of the lawyers out of the civic and charitable organizations. And I just felt a responsibility to give back.
Yeah, that's excellent. So, Russ, aside from your civic involvement and charitable involvement, how else do you enjoy life away from the firm?
Well, my wife and I play golf. Truthfully, she plays a lot better than I do because she plays a lot more than I do. I have two children who, like many people in Kansas City who grew up here, including myself, my two kids moved away for 6 or 8 years, but they've moved back as they had families, and I have 3 grandchildren, so that's an important part of my life. You're recording this right after Halloween. I spent Halloween with my grandchildren last night. It was fun.
That's fun. Russ, I generally find most attorneys are lawyers by nature and by just professionally neededness, but I like to get my listeners to have suggested reading lists. What's on your bedside table or in the office that you're reading these days you recommend?
Gentleman in Moscow. That's an excellent book that I'm reading. And then there's a book called The End of Civility that I'm reading. I do read the kind of the business books, but frankly, I'm at the end of my time, not at the beginning. I read a lot more of those early on. And I'll tell you a couple of other books. There's a great book about Churchill called Hero of the Empire. And there's a book about McKinley called Destiny Republic. So those are excellent books that I kind of go back and forth between novels and historical books.
I'm a big avid reader. I really do the same thing. I tend to find, Russ, and I don't know if you do this too, but there's something about novels that almost is stronger than truth or stronger than nonfiction that gets across points that really drive home truth. And I don't know if you find that as the same.
I do. I like to switch back and forth, but I do like the historical as well. It gives you perspective about historical figures that you may not have had and causes you to think about your own life or those of the political class today.
Yeah, a lot to think about in regards to that today. Well, Russ, kind of in close, last question, and it's almost kind of in line with that last closing comment you said. So now that you're transitioning with Chase, you're going to put a little bit more time, 8 or 9 months at the firm, and then in essence, you're going to retire. And let's assume you didn't accomplish all that we talked about. What would legacy look like going forward for you?
I do think about legacy, but it's not personal. I think about institutional legacy of the firm. We have a true strong generation of really young leaders like Chase, who's in his mid-40s, that I think we've left this firm in good hands, Jim and myself and others. We look at demographics, I wouldn't say quite a bit, but periodically, and particularly when we have conversations with other firms that we do occasionally, nothing really on the horizon right now, but occasionally we do. And so we look at the demographics. We have more equity partners under 45 than we do over 65. And the equity partners in our firm are those who generate business. So I think that says a lot about where we are and bodes well for the future. I'm very pleased and proud of the legacy that we've been able to create and that I know will continue.
That's excellent. Russ, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you, everyone who listened to this episode of the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. If you have questions or would like to recommend someone to be on the podcast, please email them to podcast@findthelions.com. If you like this podcast, leave a review on iTunes. Also, please share our podcast with others via email or social media. To share our podcast, listen to more shows, or to read the transcription of this audio, go to liongrouprerecruiting.com/podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. This podcast is for education purposes only. This content cannot be used for commercial use without written permission from the Lion Group. If you like this podcast, leave a review on iTunes.